Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves standing on the precipice of a monumental decision, a choice that thousands before you made, often with stars in their eyes and a profound misunderstanding of what lay ahead. Imagine it's the mid-1840s. The air is thick with talk of a promised land, a place called Oregon, a verdant paradise waiting just beyond the horizon. You see the handbills plastered on dusty notice boards, their ink still smelling faintly of ambition and cheap paper. They speak of rich, black soil, so fertile a dropped seed practically apologises for not sprouting instantly. They whisper of mild winters and endless forests teeming with game, of crystalline rivers choked with salmon. It sounds like a fresh start, a golden opportunity, especially if life back east has been, well, less than golden. You're picturing yourself, perhaps, leaning against a split-rail fence, gazing out over your own sprawling acres, a gentle breeze rustling the impossibly green leaves. It's a powerful dream, but let's be honest, given the realities of the journey, you probably won't survive this. The odds are stacked so incredibly high against you, it's almost laughable. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're all tuning in from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world, so drop that in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The word Oregon itself has become a kind of magic incantation on your lips, a shorthand for hope. You've heard the stories, of course. Letters from distant cousins or friends of friends paint pictures so vivid they practically shimmer. These aren't just letters, they're recruitment posters, each sentence a carefully curated highlight reel. They conveniently forget to mention the backbreaking labour, the relentless dust, or the gnawing loneliness. Think of them as the 19th century equivalent of an influencer's travel vlog, all sun-drenched vistas and carefully angled selfies, but with more dysentery. The term Oregon fever is sweeping through towns and villages, an infectious enthusiasm that makes the prospect of a 2,000-mile trek into the unknown seem not just plausible, but downright appealing. It's not just the pretty pictures, though. Life where you are now might be tough. The Panic of 1837, a major economic depression, still casts a long shadow for many. Farms have failed, businesses have shuttered, and the promise of starting over with a clean slate, on land that's supposedly free for the taking, a concept we'll definitely unpack later, is a powerful magnet. This ties into a broader, almost spiritual conviction of the era, manifest destiny. It's a powerful, intoxicating idea that the United States is divinely ordained to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. It's a mainstream historical fact that this belief fueled much of the westward expansion, a sense that it wasn't just an opportunity but a patriotic, even a holy duty. You feel it too, perhaps a stirring in your chest that this is bigger than just your dream of a farm. It's part of a grand, unfolding national epic. But beneath the glossy surface of these Oregon dreams, there are faint, unsettling whispers, grim portents that you, in your current state of feverish optimism, are probably choosing to ignore. You've heard tales of wagon trains vanishing without a trace, of cholera sweeping through camps like a phantom menace, of a landscape so vast and unforgiving it can swallow a man whole and leave no sign. Perhaps a sober-faced elder in your town, someone who's seen a bit more of the world's harsh realities, pulls you aside and mutters a warning. It ain't all sunshine and freeland, son, he might say, his eyes cloudy with an unspoken sorrow. But you dismiss it. Fear-mongering, you think. Sour grapes from someone who never had the courage to try. Or perhaps the stories are simply too outlandish, too terrible to be believed when set against the shining promise of those pamphlets. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for most emigrants was economic desperation, or the allure of adventure and a fresh start, a chance to reinvent oneself far from the prying eyes and rigid social structures of the East. Maybe for you, it's a bit of both. You're tired of scratching a living from tired soil, tired of the same faces, the same limitations. Oregon feels like a blank page, and you're eager to write your story on it. And it wasn't always purely about land or escaping poverty. Some folks had other reasons. A quirky, though perhaps not entirely uncommon tidbit is that some individuals saw the long, arduous journey west as the perfect escape route. Got a gambling debt you can't pay? A spouse you're desperate to leave behind without the messiness of a 19th century divorce? Or maybe you're just a restless soul, convinced that what you're looking for is always just over the next hill. There were even those who went with utopian ideals, planning to found perfect little communities based on fringe philosophies, only to find that human nature is remarkably consistent, even in a pristine wilderness. You might have someone in your imagined soon-to-be wagon train who's convinced they're going to start a new religion based on sun worship and interpretive dance once they hit the Willamette Valley. Good luck to them, you suppose, as long as they pull their weight with the Oxen. So you start to make your plans. You read every letter, every newspaper article that mentions Oregon. You talk to anyone who claims to know anything about the trail. The more you read, the more real it becomes, the dangers fading into the background as the image of that sun-drenched valley sharpens in your mind. You tell yourself the horror stories are exaggerated exceptions to the rule. Surely, with careful planning and a bit of luck, your journey will be different. You'll be one of the success stories, the one who writes back those glowing letters, perhaps conveniently forgetting to mention the near-death experiences or the soul-crushing despair. The dream is too bright, too compelling, to be tarnished by a few shadowy doubts. It's a bit like signing up for a marathon having only ever jogged to the corner store for a forgotten pint of milk. The enthusiasm is admirable, the preparation perhaps a little lacking. You're caught, hook, line, and sinker by those shiny Oregon dreams. So the Oregon dream has its hooks firmly in you, and your mind turns naturally to the practicalities. Or what passes for practicalities when you're about to drag your entire existence across a continent using glorified farm animals. This is the stage where your bright, shiny Oregon dream starts to get weighed down, quite literally, by the sheer amount of stuff you think you need. You're essentially packing your own coffin, or at least the supplies that will either see you through or seal your fate. Most likely the latter, if we're being brutally honest. The choices you make now in the relative comfort of your soon-to-be former home will have life or death consequences on a daily basis out there on the plains. You'll likely consult one of the many emigrant guidebooks doing the rounds. These were penned by people who'd either made the trip and survived to write about it, a key selling point, or by enterprising individuals who'd never been west of the Mississippi, but had a good imagination and access to a printing press. A mainstream historical fact is that these guides typically recommended a fairly standard list of provisions per adult. Around 200 pounds of flour, 150 pounds of bacon, the optimism of 19th century meat preservation, 10 pounds of coffee, 20 pounds of sugar, and 10 pounds of salt. Sounds straightforward, doesn't it? Almost like a grocery list for a very long, very dusty camping trip. The guides also stressed the importance of sturdy wagons, tools, firearms, and appropriate clothing. Sensible, on the surface. But here's where you, and so many others, go wonderfully, spectacularly wrong. Your brain, still buzzing with those idyllic images of Oregon, conveniently glosses over the per-adult part and starts to think about all the little comforts of home. That heavy oak rocking chair your grandmother gave you. It would look perfect on the porch of your Oregon cabin. The set of porcelain china, essential for those elegant wilderness dinner parties you'll surely be hosting. Your collection of leather-bound classic literature can't be uncultured even in paradise. Before you know it, your wagon, your lifeline, is groaning under the weight of sentimental treasures and utterly impractical desires. Remember that one emigrant who, legend has it, tried to bring a full-sized grandfather clock? The rhythmic ticking probably didn't soothe the oxen nearly as much as he'd hoped, especially when they had to drag it up a muddy incline. Historians debate the true utility of many of the more elaborate household items people attempted to transport. While some argue that maintaining a semblance of civilized life through familiar objects was crucial for morale, others point to the grim piles of discarded heirlooms that littered the trail as evidence of their folly. Every pound of unnecessary weight was a pound that strained your animals, slowed your progress, and increased the chances of a breakdown. That beautiful, albeit heavy, cast-iron stove might seem like a fantastic idea for cooking proper meals, but when your wagon wheel shatters in the middle of nowhere because the axle couldn't take the strain, you'll be wishing you'd settled for a lightweight spider skillet and a tripod. It's a classic case of wanting your Oregon cake and eating it too, without considering who's going to carry the ridiculously oversized cake tin. Then there's the food. That 150 pounds of bacon. It's likely to be rancid long before you're halfway there, attracting more flies than compliments. Your flour if not packed meticulously in waterproof barrels or sacks, will absorb moisture, turning into a solid, unappetizing brick. Or worse, a haven for weevils. You'll pack dried beans, rice, and cornmeal, the staples that will form the monotonous core of your diet for months on end. You might bring dried fruit, a welcome treat, but it's heavy and bulky. Coffee and sugar are precious commodities, hoarded and rationed with an almost religious fervour. But the sheer quantity of food required is staggering, and the methods of preservation are, shall we say, rustic. You're not vacuum sealing anything here. It's salt, smoke, and a prayer, mostly. And let's not forget the tools and spare parts. You'll need an axe, an auger, a saw, hammers, spare axle trees, wagon tongues, chains, and enough ironmongery to make a blacksmith blush. But again, the temptation is to overdo it. Do you really need that complex patent woodworking plane, or will a simple draw knife suffice when you're trying to fashion a new spoke for a wheel in the pouring rain? Every tool has weight, and every tool takes up space. Space that could be used for more food, or, heaven forbid, a slightly less cramped sleeping arrangement in that prairie schooner prison you're about to call home. One of the more ambitious packing choices involves attempts to bring the familiar into the radically unfamiliar. A quirky or fringe tidbit that surfaces in some accounts is the story of a woman who painstakingly packed several cages of canaries. Her reasoning? To bring a little cheer and music to the desolate prairies. A lovely thought, truly. One can only imagine the canaries' reaction to the first major thunderstorm or a bumpy river crossing. It's doubtful they were still chirping their melodious tunes by the time the wagon train reached the Rocky Mountains, assuming they hadn't already become a light snack for an opportunistic hawk or simply succumbed to the sheer stress of it all. Look, honey, another one's gone to the great birdcage in the sky. On the bright side, less bird seed to carry. Ultimately, your packing list is a document of your hopes, your fears, and your profound naivety. You're trying to anticipate every possible need, every conceivable emergency, but you're doing so from a place of comfortable ignorance. You haven't yet felt the ceaseless jolting of the wagon, the gnawing hunger of a missed meal, or the bone-deep weariness that will become your constant companion. You haven't understood that on the Oregon Trail, less is often more, and the wrong more is a fast track to disaster. Each poorly chosen item is another nail in that proverbial coffin, another small step towards not lasting that day, let alone the entire journey. You're loading up your future hardships, one sentimental teacup and unnecessary anvil at a time. The packing, with all its misguided enthusiasm and overloaded ambitions, is finally, agonizingly complete. Your wagon, looking suspiciously like it might burst at the seams, is ready. And so, you make your way to one of the jumping-off points, the gateway towns on the Missouri River that serve as the last outpost of what you laughingly call civilization. Places like Independence, St. Joseph, or Council Bluffs. Let's say you've chosen Independence, Missouri. As you approach, the scene that unfolds before your eyes is less a well-ordered departure lounge for a grand adventure, and more a chaotic, swirling vortex of humanity, animals, and ambition. This isn't the gentle start to a pastoral dream. This is independence. Chaos embodied. The air itself is a symphony of smells, and not the pleasant kind. Imagine the concentrated aroma of thousands of unwashed bodies, both human and animal, mingled with the smoke of countless campfires, the cloying sweetness of fermenting refuse, and the sharp tang of fear and cheap whiskey. The sounds are no better. A cacophony of braying mules, lowing oxen, shouting men, crying children, the clang of blacksmiths' hammers, the screech of ungreased wagon wheels, and the fervent, sometimes desperate negotiations of traders and emigrants alike. It's a sensory overload, a bewildering welcome to the frontier. You probably thought you were leaving the hustle and bustle behind, seeking peace in the wilderness. Joke's on you. The wilderness has come to meet you early, and it's brought all its rowdiest friends. This is where the reality of your undertaking begins to sharpen its edges. Independence in the 1840s and 50s was a boom town, its population swelling seasonally with hopeful pioneers. A mainstream historical fact is that these towns were critical for outfitting expeditions, allowing emigrants to purchase last-minute supplies, repair wagons, and crucially form or join wagon trains. It's a seller's market, and you, my friend, are a prime customer. Prices for everything, from flour to firearms, are inflated. Merchants, some reputable, many less so, prey on the anxieties and inexperience of the westward bound. You absolutely need this patent snakebite remedy, sir. Only $5. Guaranteed to work, or my name ain't Honest John. Spoiler. His name probably isn't Honest John, and the remedy is likely 90% river water and 10% wishful thinking. You'll spend your days navigating muddy streets, thronged with a bewildering assortment of characters. There are stern-faced farmers from Ohio, already looking out of their depth. There are eager young men from New York full of bravado and completely clueless about how to hitch an ox. There are families with wide-eyed children clutching worn dolls and trying to stay out from underfoot. And then there are the less savoury elements, gamblers looking for an easy mark, con artists peddling worthless goods, and thieves who see a distracted emigrant as an opportunity. It's a swirling microcosm of society, stripped of its usual niceties and simmering with a raw, restless energy. You quickly learn to keep a close eye on your belongings, and an even closer eye on who you trust. Historians still argue whether the social cohesion in these jump-off towns was primarily driven by shared purpose or by mutual suspicion and the need for self-preservation. On one hand, people were banding together, forming companies for the journey, sharing information and misinformation. On the other, it was a highly competitive environment, with everyone vying for the best animals, the most reliable guides, and the prime spots in a forming wagon train. You might strike up a tentative friendship with a family camp near you, sharing a bit of coffee and comparing notes on wagon axle grease. But you also overhear hushed arguments, accusations of theft, and the occasional drunken brawl that spills out of a makeshift saloon. It's a place of immense hope, but also profound anxiety. One quirky tidbit about these frontier towns is the sheer variety of entertainment that sprang up to cater to the transient population. Beyond the essential services of blacksmiths and provisioners, you'd find makeshift theatres, travelling preachers holding impromptu revivals, phrenologists offering to read the bumps on your head to determine your suitability for pioneering, for a small fee of course, and even the occasional medicine show, complete with flashy performers and elixirs promising to cure everything from ague to existential dread. Imagine a sort of chaotic, dusty 19th century festival, but instead of going home to a comfortable bed, you're about to embark on a 2,000-mile journey where the main attractions are dysentery and the constant threat of your oxen dying. Step right up, folks, and witness Professor Phineas P. Farnsworth juggle live ferrets while explaining the virtues of his patented liver tonic. It'll put hair on your chest and fear in your enemies. You politely decline, clutching your dwindling funds a little tighter. The process of joining a wagon train is itself a fraught affair. You need to find a group of people you can tolerate and hopefully trust for the next 4 to 6 months. Captains are elected, often based on perceived experience or sheer force of personality, rather than actual competence. Rules are debated and drawn up. Rules about guard duty, about the order of travel, about how to handle disputes. These are crucial decisions made in an atmosphere of excitement, trepidation, and often conflicting egos. You might find yourself signed up with a company led by a man whose primary qualification is a loud voice and an impressive beard, only to discover later that his navigational skills are rivaled only by his inability to manage livestock. The days in independence are a blur of preparation, negotiation, and a growing sense of unease. The shiny Oregon dream is still there, but it's now overlaid with a patina of dust, noise, and the dawning realization that this is going to be much, much harder than you ever imagined. You watch other wagons depart, a long, slow procession heading west, and a knot forms in your stomach. Are you ready? Have you forgotten anything vital? Are the people you've thrown your lot in with going to be steadfast companions or a source of constant frustration? Too late for second thoughts now. The river ferry is booked, your name is on the company roster, and the vast, intimidating prairie awaits. The chaos of independence is just a warm-up act for the sustained, grinding challenge that lies ahead. Finally, after what feels like an eternity of clamour and last-minute panics in independence, the day arrives. Your wagon, which you've probably christened with a suitably optimistic or perhaps grimly humorous name, the Oregon Star, or maybe the Doubtful Enterprise, as lumbers into line. You take your place in the slowly forming train, a creaking, groaning centipede of canvas and wood, and with a shout from the captain and the crack of whips you lurch forward. The sounds of independence fade behind you, replaced by the rhythmic squeak of axles, the lowing of oxen, the shouts of teamsters, and the dawning, inescapable reality of your new home, your prairie schooner prison. This wagon, typically a Studebaker or a Conestoga, though the latter were often too heavy for the long haul to Oregon and better suited for shorter freight routes, is now your entire world. It's your kitchen, your bedroom, your storage unit, and, if things go badly, potentially your hearse. Forget any romantic notions of riding comfortably inside, gazing wistfully at the passing scenery. That privilege is reserved for the sick, the very young, or perhaps the incredibly naive who haven't yet realised the bone-jarring reality of the ride. You, my friend, will be walking. Walking. Beside the oxen, prodding them onward, your feet sinking into dust or mud, your eyes scanning the horizon for, well, anything other than more horizon. Let's talk about the dimensions of your new mobile domicile. These wagons were generally about 4 feet wide and 10 to 12 feet long, covered with an oiled or painted canvas top stretched over wooden hoops. Into this confined space, you've crammed literally everything you own, or at least everything you thought you needed after that packing frenzy. Barrels of flour, sacks of beans, tools, bedding, clothes, cooking utensils, spare parts, and maybe that one sentimental, ridiculously impractical item you just couldn't leave behind. Remember that rocking chair? It's probably already digging into a sack of precious sugar. There is no concept of aisle space or ergonomic design. It's a Tetris game played with your worldly possessions, and you always lose. The smell inside is something you'll get intimately acquainted with. It's a heady perfume of damp canvas, unwashed bodies, yours included after a few days without a proper bath, stale food, axle grease, and the ever-present aroma of your draft animals, which conveniently are usually tethered right next to your bedroom at night. If something spills, and something will spill, probably something sticky or smelly or both, it just becomes part of the wagon's unique olfactory signature. You might try to air it out during stops, flapping the canvas covers, but it's a temporary reprieve at best. This isn't a quaint tiny home, it's a cramped, bumpy, and frankly, quite fragrant box on wheels. The motion is relentless. The trail is not a paved highway, it's a pair of ruts at best winding over uneven prairie, through muddy bottoms and across rocky outcrops. The wagon pitches and sways, jolts and shudders. A mainstream historical fact is that these wagons had no suspension system beyond the inherent give of the wooden wheels and frame. Every bump, every rock, every dip in the terrain is transmitted directly into the wagon's contents, and into the bones of anyone unfortunate enough to be riding inside for long. Imagine being inside a washing machine during the spin cycle, but slower, hotter, and with more dust. That's a gentle day. On a bad day, items shift, crash, and break. Tempers flare. The constant vibration makes even simple tasks like mending clothes or writing in a journal a significant challenge, and it's not just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. Items can fall from their precarious perches. Children, if allowed to ride unsupervised, could easily be thrown out by a sudden lurch, with tragic consequences. The very act of getting in and out of a moving, or even a stationary wagon, especially for women whose long skirts could easily get tangled, was a hazard. You'll develop a healthy respect for the simple act of staying put and holding on. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of such prolonged confinement in these wagons, especially for women and children who might have spent more time in or near them than the men who were often walking alongside. Was it a comforting, mobile hearth, a tiny piece of home in a vast wilderness, or was it a suffocating, isolating cage that amplified anxieties and frayed nerves? The truth probably lies somewhere in between, varying greatly from family to family and individual to individual. For you right now, it's probably feeling more like the latter. You trip over the same water keg for the 10th time, bang your head on a low-hanging hoop, and try to find a space to sit that isn't already occupied by 3 sacks of cornmeal and a sleeping child. A quirky, or perhaps just grimly practical tidbit you'll quickly learn is the art of making do within this confined space. Your dining table might be a plank laid across 2 barrels, your wash basin, a single bucket shared by the family, your privacy, non-existent. Every cough, every sigh, every whispered conversation is public domain. You'll learn to sleep wedged between sacks of provisions, curled up in impossible positions, waking stiff and unrested. The romance of sleeping under the stars wears thin when the stars are obscured by your canvas roof, and the air is thick with the snores of your travelling companions. You might even joke that your wagon is so full, if you dropped a pin, it would take a week to hit the floorboards. Ha! Ha! The oxen don't find it funny either. The prairie schooner, so named for its white canvas top that resembled a ship's sail from a distance, is your ark, your fortress, and your frustration. It's a symbol of your hopes, but also a constant reminder of the fragility of your enterprise. A broken wheel, a snapped axle, a torn canvas cover. These aren't minor inconveniences. They are major crises that can halt your progress, deplete your resources, and even threaten your survival. You'll come to know every creak, every groan of its timbers. You'll learn to pack it, unpack it, and repack it with a weary efficiency. It's not the grand vessel of your Oregon dreams. It's a functional, flawed, and deeply uncomfortable necessity. And for the next several months, this rolling prison is your life. Better get used to the smell. Your prairie schooner prison, as cramped and fragrant as it is, wouldn't move an inch without the creatures pulling it. Now your attention, and indeed your very survival, shifts to the unsung heroes and frequent victims of the Oregon Trail, your draft animals. Choosing them back in Independence was a critical decision, perhaps more critical than selecting your brand of flour or the pattern on your grandmother's china you insisted on bringing. Now caring for these beastly burdens, and watching them inevitably suffer, becomes a daily exercise in hope, frustration, and often heartbreak. This is the animal agony phase of your adventure. You had a choice, primarily between oxen, mules, and horses. Horses, while faster and more dashing, were generally considered too delicate and prone to injury or illness for the long, arduous journey. They required better grazing and more grain than was often available. Mules, a hybrid of a male donkey and a female horse, were tougher than horses, sure-footed, and possessed legendary endurance. They were a popular choice, but the most common and often recommended draft animal was the ox. A mainstream historical fact is that oxen, mature castrated male cattle, were favoured for their strength, their placid temperament mostly, and their ability to subsist on the often poor forage found along the trail. They were also grimly a source of food if things got truly desperate. You probably opted for oxen, at least a yoke or two, maybe 3 for your heavy wagon. Learning to manage these animals is your first and steepest learning curve. If you're a city slicker fresh from a clerk's desk, this is a baptism by fire, or rather, by hoof and horn. You have to learn how to yoke them, a process that looks deceptively simple, but involves heavy wooden yokes, bows, and chains, and a pair of animals that may or may not be cooperative. An improperly fitted yoke can cause sores and lameness, rendering your ox useless. You need to learn the specific calls and commands: G, turn right; haw, turn left; get up, go; and whoa, stop. Shouting the wrong command at the wrong time can lead to chaos, tangled lines, or your wagon veering off into a ditch. It's a language you must master, and quickly. Your oxen, bless their slow, methodical hearts, are not mind readers. The daily care is relentless. At the end of a long day's travel, often 10 to 15 miles, sometimes more, sometimes less, your first priority isn't your own aching feet or empty stomach. It's the animals. They need to be unyoked, driven to whatever pasture can be found, watered, and checked for injuries. Their hooves, split from rocks or softened by mud, need attention. Sores from an ill-fitting yoke or harness need to be treated, often with whatever crude remedies are at hand. Axle grease was a popular, if not particularly effective, salve. You'll spend hours searching for decent grazing, as the areas around popular campsites are quickly stripped bare. Poor grazing means weak animals, and weak animals mean slow progress, or worse, no progress at all. And then there's the sheer variety of ways your animals can and will try to die on you. They can get alkali poisoning from drinking tainted water, they can bloat from eating certain types of rich clover, they can suffer from hollow horn or hollow tail, vague pioneer afflictions whose cures were equally vague and often involved drilling holes in horns or splitting tails and stuffing them with salt and pepper. A quirky and rather horrifying tidbit of 19th century veterinary science. Historians still argue about what these conditions actually were, with modern interpretations suggesting everything from nutrient deficiencies to infections. Regardless of the diagnosis, the outcome for the animal was often grim. They can also simply be stolen. While large-scale attacks by Native Americans were rarer than fiction suggests, opportunistic raids for livestock by both natives and unscrupulous white traders or fellow emigrants were a real concern. Guard duty at night wasn't just about protecting your family, it was about protecting your horsepower, or rather, your ox power. Losing an ox was a catastrophe. It meant redistributing the load, further straining your remaining animals, or facing the heartbreaking decision to abandon some of your precious cargo. Perhaps that rocking chair is starting to look a bit less essential now, isn't it? The suffering of the animals is a constant, unavoidable part of the journey. You see them straining against their yokes, ribs showing, hides caked with dust and sweat. You see them stumble, their eyes dull with exhaustion. You hear their groans and soft bellows of distress. And when one of them finally collapses, unable to rise, you face a brutal choice. Try to nurse it back to health, losing precious time and slowing the entire train, or make the pragmatic, agonizing decision to put it out of its misery and move on. There's no ASPCA on the prairie, you'll see. Countless animal carcasses lining the trail, monuments to past failures and a grim reminder of your own animal's fragility. It's a daily dose of empathy fatigue. You might start out feeling deep sorrow for every suffering beast, but after weeks and months, a certain grim practicality tends to set in. Well, Bessie's down. Shame. Anyone got a sharp knife? And who wants to help butcher? The bond you form with these creatures, despite the hardship, can be surprisingly strong. You rely on them completely. You talk to them, curse them, encourage them, and mourn them. They're your partners in this insane endeavour, silent witnesses to your struggles and your small triumphs. But the trail is a harsh master, and it takes its toll on beast as much as, if not more than, on man. Their agony is an integral part of your own, a constant heavy weight on your conscience and your chances of success. Without them, you're truly stranded, your Oregon dream turning into a sun-bleached skeleton on the plains, just like so many of the poor beasts that didn't make it. With your animals tended to, or at least as tended to as circumstances allow, your attention finally, grudgingly, turns to the human element of this grand, dusty parade. And what you discover is that life on the Oregon Trail is not a leisurely sightseeing tour. It's an unyielding daily routine of back-breaking labour, a monotonous cycle that begins before the sun even considers peeking over the horizon, and ends long after it has surrendered the sky to the stars. This is your sun-up to sundown suffering, a relentless grind that will test your physical and mental endurance to its absolute limits. The day starts early. Around 4 a.m, sometimes earlier, a horn or a gunshot shatters the pre-dawn stillness. That's your cue. No hitting the snooze button on the prairie. The snooze button is probably a hungry coyote sizing up your smallest child. You stumble out of your prairie schooner prison, stiff and still half asleep, into the chill morning air. The first order of business, after a hasty and often inadequate personal ablution, more on that delightful topic later, is the animals. You and the other men round them up from wherever they were grazing, or more likely trying to find something edible amongst the dust and depleted grasses. You bring them back to camp, yoke them to the wagons, a process that's still a struggle, especially with tired, grumpy oxen and equally tired, grumpy humans. While the men are wrestling with the livestock, the women and older children are already busy. Campfires need to be rekindled or started anew, often with damp wood or precious buffalo chips, dried bison dung, the ubiquitous fuel of the plains. A quirky tidbit. Collecting these chips was a common and not particularly beloved chore for children and women. Imagine filling your apron with sun-baked patties of animal waste, all before breakfast. Certainly adds a certain je ne sais quoi to the morning coffee. Breakfast itself is a hurried, meagre affair. Typically coffee, bacon if you're lucky and it hasn't gone completely green, and some form of bread. Perhaps salt-rising bread, if someone had the foresight and skill, or more likely a hastily fried flapjack, or a piece of hardtack, a flour and water biscuit so durable it could probably stop a musket ball. You eat standing up, or perched on a wagon tongue, eager to get moving. By around 7 a.m, if all goes well, which it rarely does, the call to catch up echoes through the camp and the wagons begin to roll, and then the walking starts. For most of the men, and many of the older boys, the day is spent walking beside the wagons, urging the animals on, navigating obstacles and keeping an eye out for trouble. This isn't a gentle stroll in the park. You're covering on average 10 to 15 miles a day, but it can be as little as 2 or 3 on a bad day. Think river crossings or deep mud, or as much as 20 if the terrain is good and the animals are feeling spry, a rare occurrence. You're walking through choking dust kicked up by hundreds of hooves and wheels, or slogging through ankle-deep mud after a rainstorm. The sun beats down mercilessly, or a cold wind whips across the plains, chilling you to the bone. There's no shade, no respite, just the endless undulating landscape and the plodding rhythm of the journey. The women too often walk to spare the animals or to escape the jolting confines of the wagon. They might carry infants or lead younger children by the hand. Their tasks, however, are far from over once the wagons are moving. There's mending to be done, clothes to be washed, when water is available and time permits a stop, and the constant supervision of children, who have an uncanny knack for finding new and inventive ways to get into trouble in a seemingly featureless landscape. A mainstream historical fact is that the division of labour on the trail, while somewhat mirroring societal norms of the time, often blurred due to necessity. Men might help with cooking or childcare if their wives were ill, and women might assist with driving animals or repairing wagons if circumstances demanded. Survival trumped strict gender roles, at least to some extent. Around noon, if a suitable spot with water and a little grass can be found, the train might halt for a nooning. This is a short break, an hour or 2 at most, to rest the animals and eat a cold lunch, usually leftovers from breakfast or more hardtack and jerky. There's no time for elaborate meal preparation. Every minute spent stationary is a minute not making progress towards Oregon. Then it's back to the yokes, back to the trail, back to the walking. The afternoon is a repeat of the morning, only now you're more tired, more irritable, and probably coated in an even thicker layer of grime. The sun climbs higher, the shadows lengthen, and the monotony becomes almost hypnotic. The same conversations are had, the same complaints are aired, the same anxieties bubble just beneath the surface. You watch the odometer you might have rigged to your wagon wheel, a common practice, ticking off the fractions of a mile with agonizing slowness. Each mile gained feels like a victory, but the remaining distance still stretches out like an impossible eternity. Historians still argue about the extent to which the daily grind fostered a sense of community versus exacerbating interpersonal conflicts within the wagon trains. Did shared hardship forge unbreakable bonds, or did constant proximity and stress lead to simmering resentments and open feuds? Diaries from the period show evidence of both. Acts of incredible kindness and selflessness existed alongside bitter disputes over resources, accusations of shirking duty, and personality clashes that could make the long days even longer. You might find yourself relying on the family in the next wagon for a spare cup of flour one day, and then arguing with them heatedly about whose turn it is to stand guard the next. As dusk begins to settle, usually around 6 or 7 p.m, the train halts for the night. The wagons are formed into a corral, a defensive circle providing some measure of security against potential threats, animal or human, and a convenient enclosure for the livestock. Then, the evening chores begin, a mirror image of the morning rush, only fueled by exhaustion. Animals unyoked and tended, firewood or buffalo chips gathered, water fetched, often from a muddy creek some distance away, and the evening meal prepared. This might be a slightly more substantial affair than breakfast or lunch, perhaps a stew if game has been shot, or more beans and bacon. After supper, there might be a brief period for mending, for writing in a journal by the flickering firelight, for a song or a story if anyone has the energy, but more often than not, weary bodies crave sleep. By 9 p.m, most of the camp is quiet, save for the sounds of the night guards and the restless stirring of the animals. You crawl back into your wagon, onto your hard bed, knowing that in just a few short hours the horn will blow again, and the sun-up to sundown suffering will recommence. It's a brutal, soul-crushing routine, and it's your life, day in, day out, for months on end. Sweet dreams. You've survived another day of sun-up to sundown suffering, your muscles ache, your skin is caked with grime, and your spirit is probably feeling a bit frayed around the edges. As you settle down for the night, or perhaps as you prepare that meagre morning meal, your thoughts inevitably turn to food, or more accurately, to the monotonous, often unappetizing, and frequently insufficient fuel that's supposed to get you 2,000 miles across a continent. Welcome to your Grim Grub Guide, where the menu rarely changes, the quality is highly suspect, and every meal is a reminder that you are slowly but surely being starved of variety and, quite possibly, essential nutrients. Remember that optimistic shopping list back in Independence? The 200 pounds of flour, 150 pounds of bacon, coffee, sugar, salt. It sounded like a lot, didn't it? But spread that over 4 to 6 months, for an entire family, factoring in spoilage, accidents, like a barrel of flour falling into a river during a crossing, and the sheer caloric demands of relentless physical labour, and you'll quickly realise it's barely adequate. You're on a forced diet, and it's not one any modern nutritionist would recommend. The Oregon Trail diet was high in carbohydrates, flour, cornmeal, high in preserved fats, bacon, lard, and desperately low in fresh fruits, vegetables, and often fresh meat. Your daily bread, quite literally, is flour. You'll bake it into biscuits, fry it into flapjacks, or if you're feeling ambitious and have a Dutch oven and good coals, attempt a loaf of bread. But this isn't your artisanal sourdough from the local farmer's market. This is flour that's been bouncing around in a wagon for weeks, possibly months. It might be gritty with dust infested with weevils, which you'll try to sift out or just resign yourself to as extra protein, or starting to get a bit musty. You'll learn to be very creative with flour, because it's the backbone of almost every meal. A popular trail dish was slapjack, a simple pancake made from flour, water, and a bit of salt or sugar, fried in bacon grease. Delicious. If your standards have plummeted sufficiently, then there's the bacon. Oh, the bacon. In the cool, early days of the journey, it might be a welcome, salty, fatty treat. But as the weeks wear on and the temperatures rise, that bacon, often poorly cured and packed in barrels, begins a slow, inexorable descent into rancidity. The fat turns yellow and acrid. The meat develops a greenish tinge and an aroma that could stun a buzzard. You'll scrape off the worst bits, boil it to try and remove some of the gaminess, and douse it in pepper. But there's no escaping the fact that you're often eating semi-putrid pig. A mainstream historical fact is that scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a common ailment on the trail, precisely because of this lack of fresh produce. Bleeding gums, loose teeth, and lethargy were the unwelcome symptoms, adding another layer of misery to your already challenging existence. Coffee was the lifeblood of the trail, a morning ritual and a small comfort in a world of discomfort. But it was often green coffee beans that you had to roast yourself over the campfire, a tricky process that could easily result in burnt, bitter grounds. And sugar, if you had it, was rationed like gold dust. Many emigrants ran out of coffee and sugar long before they reached Oregon, resorting to brewing ersatz coffee from roasted peas, corn, or dandelion roots. It wasn't quite the same. Another cup of that delightful burnt pea juice, dear, you might ask your spouse, with a cheerfulness you absolutely do not feel. If you're lucky, your diet might be supplemented by hunting. Bison, antelope, deer, or smaller game like rabbits and prairie chickens could provide a welcome infusion of fresh meat. But hunting was time-consuming, required skill and ammunition, both of which were finite resources, and was often unreliable. For every successful hunt, there were many more days of fruitless searching, and when a large animal like a bison was killed, it created a frenzy of activity, butchering, cooking what could be eaten immediately, and trying to preserve the rest by cutting it into thin strips and jerking it, drying it in the sun or over a slow fire. This jerky, tough and chewy, would become another trail staple, gnawed on during the long marches. Foraging for wild edibles, berries, roots, wild onions, could also provide a small nutritional boost, but it required knowledge, poisonous plants looked awfully similar to edible ones, and opportunity. Plus, the areas along the trail were quickly picked over by the thousands who passed before you. You might get excited about a handful of wild currants, only to find they taste like disappointment and give you a stomachache. Historians still argue about the true extent of starvation on the Oregon Trail. While outright famine was rare for well-prepared groups, chronic malnutrition and food-related illnesses were rampant. The monotonous diet, lacking in essential vitamins and minerals, weakened immune systems and made people more susceptible to diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. You might not be literally starving to death, but your body is definitely feeling the strain of a diet that's more about staving off immediate hunger than providing balanced nutrition. It's a slow, grinding deprivation. One quirky or fringe tidbit about trail food involves the desperate measures people took when supplies ran truly low. There are accounts, though perhaps exaggerated or isolated, of emigrants eating their candles, made from tallow, so technically edible if disgusting. or boiling their rawhide lashings to create a sort of gelatinous, unappetizing soup. Let's hope your situation doesn't get that dire. But the very existence of such stories speaks to the constant anxiety about food. You dream of fresh apples, of a crisp salad, of a piece of meat that doesn't taste like it's been embalmed. Instead, you get another plate of beans, another greasy slapjack, and the lingering taste of bacon that's seen better days. Your Grim Grub Guide is a short book, with very few appealing chapters, and you have to read it, or rather, eat it, every single day. It's enough to make you wish you'd packed more of that weevil-infested flour. At least the weevils were a change of pace. After another meal from your less-than-gourmet Grim Grub Guide, your thoughts, or rather your body's urgent demands, turn to another essential: water. It seems so simple, so fundamental. But on the Oregon Trail, finding and consuming water is akin to playing a daily game of liquid Russian roulette. Every sip you take, every canteen you fill carries a potential risk. The clear, cool streams you imagined in your Oregon fantasies are often few and far between, replaced by sources that are murky, stagnant, or downright poisonous. The need for water is constant and immense. You're toiling under a hot sun, losing fluids through sweat. Your animals, hauling tons of supplies, need to drink gallons daily. A typical wagon train required a staggering amount of water just to keep moving. A mainstream historical fact is that lack of water was one of the most significant limiting factors for travel, often dictating routes and camping spots. Guidebooks would meticulously detail the locations of known springs and rivers, but these sources could be unreliable, dry in a drought year, or already fouled by previous travellers and their livestock. So, what are you drinking? Often it's river water, the Platte, the Sweetwater, the Snake. These rivers, while lifelines, are also the continent's great drainage ditches. They carry silt, animal waste, from your own train and the countless others, and who knows what else. The water is often warm, muddy, and unappetizing. You'll try to let the sediment settle or strain it through a cloth, but it's still a gamble. You might find a spring, a seemingly pristine source bubbling from the earth. But how do you know it's safe? It could be an alkali spring, loaded with dissolved salts that can sicken you and kill your animals. The telltale sign is often a ring of animal skeletons around it, a grim warning that you ignore at your peril. Looks a bit salty, dear, but the last 3 oxen that drank here only twitched for an hour. Should be fine, you might say, trying to convince yourself. Then there are the sloughs and prairie potholes, stagnant pools of water that collect after rains. In desperation, you might drink from these, even if they're teeming with visible life. Mosquito larvae, unidentifiable swimming specks, and a general film of primordial ooze. You tell yourself that boiling will make it safe, and sometimes it does, but boiling doesn't remove chemical contaminants, and fuel for boiling can be scarce. Sometimes you just close your eyes, hold your nose, and gulp it down, hoping for the best. The thirst is a more immediate torment than the potential for future illness. The taste is something you'll never forget. Water from the Platte River, for instance, was notoriously bad, often described as too thick to drink, too thin to plough. It was silty, warm, and had a distinctly organic flavour. You might try to improve it with a bit of ginger or vinegar if you have any, but mostly you just endure it. Some pioneers even tried to filter water by digging holes in the sand a few feet from a riverbank, hoping cleaner water would seep in. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it just gave them sandy, muddy water. Historians still argue about the precise role contaminated water played in the spread of diseases like cholera versus factors like poor sanitation in camps. It was likely a deadly combination of both. Cholera, transmitted through water or food contaminated with the Vibrio cholerae bacterium, could kill a healthy adult in a matter of hours. One sip from the wrong source, one unwashed hand preparing food after contact with contaminated water, and you could be next. The fear of bad water was constant and pervasive. A quirky or fringe tidbit regarding water on the trail is the occasional desperate attempt to find it through dowsing, or water witching. Someone in the train, perhaps an elderly individual with a reputation for the gift, might walk slowly across the parched landscape, holding a forked stick, waiting for it to dip auspiciously, indicating subterranean water. While scientifically unsubstantiated, in the face of desperate thirst, people were willing to try anything, and if, by sheer coincidence, they happened to find a seep or a damp spot after such a performance, it only reinforced the belief. You might watch old Jedediah with his divining rod, half sceptical, half desperately hopeful, as he wanders across the cracked earth. "He found water for Cousin Amos back in 49 this way," someone whispers, conveniently forgetting the 10 times he found nothing but more dust. The lack of clean water also had a profound impact on hygiene, or the distinct lack thereof. Bathing was a luxury, infrequent and often consisting of a quick splash in a muddy creek. Laundry, when it could be done, involved harsh soaps, if you had them, and whatever water was available, meaning your clothes were often just as grimy after washing as before, only now they were damp and grimy. This lack of cleanliness, directly tied to the scarcity and poor quality of water, contributed to skin infections, lice infestations, and the general miasma of unwellness that often hung over a wagon train. You become obsessed with water. You dream about it. You scan the horizon constantly for the telltale line of green that might indicate a watercourse. You hoard it in your canteen, taking small, reluctant sips. You watch your animals with anxiety, knowing their survival, and therefore, yours depends on it. Every decision about where to camp, how far to push, is dictated by the availability of this most precious and most perilous resource. You'll drink things you wouldn't have considered fit for washing your dog with back home. And with every mouthful, you're rolling the dice, hoping this isn't the drink that unleashes a microscopic army of death into your system. The Oregon Trail could be a very thirsty place, and that thirst could kill you just as surely as an accident or an arrow. You've navigated the chaos of independence, endured the prairie schooner prison, stressed over your beastly burdens, survived the sun-up to sundown suffering, choked down the grim grub, and taken your chances with liquid Russian roulette. You might be thinking, what else could possibly go wrong? Oh, you sweet summer child. You've forgotten the invisible enemy, the silent stalker that travels with every wagon train, the reaper that claims far more lives on the Oregon Trail than any other cause: disease. Cholera and creeping death are your constant, unwelcome companions on this journey. Forget dramatic skirmishes with Native Americans or thrilling bison hunts. The real killer on the trail was microbial. A mainstream historical fact is that diseases, particularly cholera, dysentery and typhoid fever, were responsible for the vast majority of deaths among emigrants. Estimates vary, but some historians suggest that as many as 1 in 10 or even more of those who started the journey never made it to Oregon, primarily due to illness. These aren't quick, clean deaths. They are often agonizing, undignified, and terrifyingly swift. Cholera was the king of killers. Imagine this. You wake up feeling perfectly healthy, ready for another day of plodding westward. By mid-morning you feel a bit off, a slight cramping in your stomach. By noon, you're experiencing violent, uncontrollable diarrhea and vomiting. The dehydration is rapid and severe. Your skin turns bluish, your eyes sink, your muscles cramp painfully. Within hours, you can go from a robust individual to a shriveled, dying husk. And there's almost nothing anyone can do for you. Your companions watch in horror, helpless, knowing they could be next. The speed and ferocity of cholera were particularly terrifying. It could sweep through a wagon train like wildfire, leaving a trail of fresh graves in its wake. Remember all that questionable water you've been drinking? Cholera loved that water. Dysentery, often called the bloody flux, was another common scourge. Caused by bacteria or amoebas, it led to severe diarrhea, often with blood and mucus, abdominal pain, and fever. While not always as rapidly fatal as cholera, it was debilitating, weakening its victims over days or weeks, making them susceptible to other infections, and just generally making life an utter misery. You're already dealing with poor food, exhaustion, and stress. Add in uncontrollable, painful bowel movements, and your will to live starts to take a serious nosedive. You might joke darkly that the most well-worn path on the trail isn't the wagon ruts, but the path leading away from camp for private moments, which are becoming increasingly frequent and less private. Then there's typhoid fever, spread by contaminated food or water, usually due to poor sanitation. It's a slower, more insidious killer, with symptoms like prolonged fever, headache, fatigue, and a characteristic rash. It could linger for weeks, sapping your strength, leaving you delirious. Other diseases abounded too: measles, mumps, and whooping cough, especially dangerous for children, pneumonia and influenza, exacerbated by exposure and exhaustion, and various fevers of unknown origin, lumped together under vague terms like mountain fever or camp fever. Your 19th century immune system, already battered by malnutrition and stress, is fighting a losing battle against an army of invisible invaders. The conditions on the trail were a perfect breeding ground for these diseases. Sanitation was rudimentary at best. Human waste often contaminated water sources. Flies, thriving on refuse and animal droppings, were everywhere, acting as vectors for disease. Personal hygiene was a constant struggle. Food preparation was often done with unwashed hands in dusty, unsanitary conditions. You're living in close quarters with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of other people, any one of whom could be carrying the next plague. It's a germaphobe's nightmare, and you're living it 24/7. Historians still argue about the exact mortality rates from specific diseases, as diagnoses were often imprecise and record-keeping spotty. Was that sudden death from summer complaint actually cholera or severe food poisoning? Did lung fever mean pneumonia or tuberculosis? The labels mattered less to the victims and their grieving families than the tragic outcome. What is clear is that the sheer volume of sickness and death was staggering. A quirky, or rather grimly poignant tidbit, is the array of preventative measures and supposed cures that people desperately employed. Besides the patent medicines of dubious efficacy, some wore bags of camphor or asafoetida around their necks, believing the strong smells would ward off disease. Others swore by concoctions of red pepper and whiskey, or various herbal remedies passed down through families. When cholera struck, treatments might include laudanum, an opium tincture, to try and stop the diarrhea, or calomel, mercurous chloride, a toxic purgative that probably did more harm than good. These weren't cures, they were acts of desperation in the face of overwhelming odds. Don't worry, Martha, this spoonful of mercury should sort out that pesky cholera. Might make your teeth fall out, but small price to pay, eh? This is your medical care, folks. The psychological toll of watching your loved ones, your friends, your travelling companions succumb to these horrific illnesses was immense. The constant fear, the grief, the awareness of your own vulnerability, it all added to the crushing burden of the journey. Every morning you'd anxiously check on your family, dreading the first signs of sickness. Every new grave you passed was a stark reminder of the fragility of life on the trail. You might try to maintain a brave face, to tell yourself it won't happen to you, to your family. But deep down, you know the odds. Disease isn't just a possibility, it's a probability. It's the unseen passenger in every wagon, the shadow that lengthens with every mile. You're not just fighting the landscape and the elements, you're fighting an invisible war against an enemy that gives no quarter and takes no prisoners. And in this war you are woefully under-equipped. So say your prayers, wash your hands if you can find clean water and soap, and try not to think too hard about what might be brewing in your gut after that last questionable drink or meal. The creeping death is always just a cough, a cramp, a shiver away. You're dodging cholera, choking down rancid bacon, and wondering if your oxen will see another sunrise. Surely, if you can just avoid the major diseases and keep your animals alive, you're on the home stretch, right? Not so fast. The Oregon Trail has a delightful array of other more mundane yet surprisingly effective ways to dispatch you. Welcome to the world of oops, accidental annihilation, where the everyday business of trail life is packed with hidden dangers, and your own clumsiness can be just as lethal as any microbe. It's easy to overlook these dangers when faced with the dramatic threat of cholera or the grinding misery of starvation. But accidents were a constant and significant cause of injury and death on the trail. A mainstream historical fact is that accidental shootings were distressingly common. Almost everyone carried firearms for hunting and perceived self-defense. These were muzzle loaders, often flintlocks or percussion caps, and handling them safely, especially in the bumpy, chaotic environment of a wagon train, required care and expertise that many emigrants lacked. Guns were kept loaded, propped in wagons, or carried carelessly. A jolt of the wagon, a snagged hammer, a moment of inattention while cleaning a weapon, and tragedy could strike. Children, curious and unsupervised, were particularly at risk, either from finding and playing with loaded guns, or from being in the wrong place at the wrong time when an adult mishandled one. Then there are the wagons themselves. Those prairie schooner prisons aren't just uncomfortable, they're heavy, unwieldy death traps on wheels. Falling from a moving wagon was a serious risk, especially for children who might be riding on top of poorly secured goods or playing too close to the edge. But the most common and gruesome wagon-related accident was being run over. This often happened when someone, frequently a child but sometimes an adult, fell while walking alongside the wagon, or attempted to get on or off while it was in motion. The massive iron-rimmed wheels, weighing hundreds of pounds each, would pass over a limb or a body with devastating force, crushing bones and causing horrific internal injuries. There were no emergency rooms, no orthopaedic surgeons. A crushed limb often meant amputation with a carpenter's saw, and a bottle of whiskey for anaesthetic if you were lucky. More often, it meant a slow, agonising death from infection or shock. You'd think people would learn, but the diaries are filled with heartbreaking accounts of these kinds of accidents. Little Timmy tried to hop onto the wagon tongue today. He won't be needing his boots anymore, might be a grimly understated journal entry. Animals, your beastly burdens, were another source of accidental injury. An ox, startled by a snake or a sudden noise, could bolt, kicking or goring anyone in its path. A mule, living up to its stereotype, might deliver a well-aimed kick to an unwary handler. Even the simple act of yoking or unyoking these powerful, often unpredictable creatures carried risks of crushed fingers, broken toes, or more serious injuries if a panicked animal dragged you. You're tired, you're distracted, you let your guard down for a moment, and suddenly you're nursing a broken arm or worse, wondering how you'll manage your share of the work. Even seemingly innocuous daily chores held hidden dangers. Chopping firewood with a dull axe while exhausted could easily lead to a nasty gash. Campfires, essential for cooking and warmth, could get out of control, especially in dry, windy conditions, leading to burns or even igniting nearby wagons or tents. Handling hot cooking pots and kettles over open flames was a recipe for scalds. And then there's the simple act of walking. The terrain was uneven, littered with rocks, roots, and animal burrows. A twisted ankle might not sound like much, but if you couldn't keep up with the wagon train, it could be a death sentence, forcing your family to make an agonising decision, or the entire train to slow down, endangering everyone. Historians still argue about whether the prevalence of accidents was due more to the inherent dangers of the environment and equipment, or to the inexperience and carelessness of the emigrants themselves. Many pioneers were farmers, accustomed to hard work, but not necessarily to the unique challenges of a long-distance overland journey, with unfamiliar equipment and in a constantly changing environment. Others were city dwellers, utterly unprepared for the physical demands and practical skills required. It was a learning by doing, and sometimes learning by dying situation. A quirky, or perhaps just tragically absurd tidbit is the sheer variety of freak accidents that occurred. People were struck by lightning, they drowned in shallow creeks, they were injured by falling trees or branches during storms. Some even managed to injure themselves with their own tools in bizarre ways. Imagine trying to explain how you managed to impale your foot with a pitchfork while trying to retrieve a dropped hat. The trail had an almost malicious inventiveness when it came to accidental harm. You could almost imagine a sarcastic trail deity keeping score. Cholera got 5 yesterday, but a runaway pig chasing a dropped biscuit took out old Mrs. Higgins. Points for originality. These accidents, while perhaps less dramatic than a cholera epidemic, had a corrosive effect on morale. Each injury, each preventable death, was a reminder of the constant pervasive risk. It fostered an atmosphere of vigilance but also of weary resignation. You tried to be careful, you tried to supervise your children, you tried to anticipate the dangers, but sometimes, despite your best efforts, things just went wrong. A moment of distraction, a freak occurrence, a piece of bad luck, and your Oregon dream could end abruptly and pointlessly, not with a bang, but with a whimper, or a sickening crunch. So, while you're worrying about the big, headline-grabbing killers, don't forget the small, insidious ones. The loose wagon wheel, the carelessly handled firearm, the slippery riverbank, the unpredictable hoof. On the Oregon Trail, accidental annihilation is always just an oops away. Keep your wits about you, watch your step, and maybe, just maybe, you'll avoid becoming another cautionary tale whispered around a campfire. You've managed to avoid shooting yourself, being crushed by your own wagon, or succumbing to a festering axe wound. You're even miraculously still one step ahead of the cholera, but the trail has more physical obstacles to throw in your path, and some of the most daunting are the rivers. There are no picturesque stone bridges out here, no convenient ferry services with regular schedules and safety inspections. What you face are wild, untamed rivers, drowning machines that must be crossed if you're ever to see Oregon. Each major river crossing is a logistical nightmare, a moment of high anxiety, and a very real opportunity to lose your wagon, your supplies, your animals, and your life. The Platte River, which you'll follow for hundreds of miles, is your first major watery challenge. It's famously described as a mile wide and an inch deep, but that's a deceptive characterization. While often shallow, it's also full of shifting sandbars, hidden channels, and treacherous quicksand. The current can be deceptively strong, and the sheer width of it means a crossing can take hours, exposing you and your animals to the elements and the strain. You can't just splash through it haphazardly. You need a plan. A mainstream historical fact is that several methods were used for river crossings, depending on the depth and current of the river. If the water was shallow enough, say less than 3 or 4 feet, you might attempt to ford it directly. This involved double teaming or even triple teaming your oxen, with men on horseback or wading alongside to guide the animals and prevent the wagons from bogging down or being swept sideways. Wagon beds were often caulked with tar or grease, or even raised on blocks to try and keep the contents dry, but water inevitably seeped in, soaking precious flour and sugar and ruining anything not packed in watertight containers. Imagine the sheer, brute effort of dragging a 2,500-pound wagon, pulled by protesting oxen, across a quarter-mile or more of moving water and sucking mud, all while shouting encouragement and trying not to get swept off your own feet. If the river was deeper, or the current too swift for fording, you had other, even less appealing options. One was to convert your wagon box into a makeshift boat. This involved removing the wheels and undercarriage, and then caulking the wagon bed as thoroughly as possible to make it reasonably watertight. This boat would then be floated across, often pulled by ropes or guided by men swimming alongside. This was a time-consuming, laborious process, and if your caulking job wasn't up to snuff, your wagon, and all its contents, could slowly, elegantly sink to the bottom of the river. Well, there goes Grandma's rocking chair, you might sigh, watching it disappear beneath the murky waves. Hope the catfish appreciate Queen Anne legs. Another method was to construct a raft if timber was available. This involved felling trees, lashing them together, and then carefully manoeuvring the wagons one by one onto this unstable platform to be poled or pulled across. This was even more time-consuming and hugely dependent on finding suitable materials and having the skills to build something that wouldn't immediately disintegrate midstream. Sometimes, enterprising individuals would set up makeshift ferry operations at particularly difficult crossings, charging exorbitant fees to transport wagons across on rickety rafts or crude flatboats. You'd pay, of course, because the alternative was to be stranded or risk everything on a dangerous self-crossing. The dangers were manifold. Wagons could overturn in strong currents, spilling their contents and occupants into the cold, fast-flowing water. Animals, panicked by the water or exhausted by the effort, could drown. People, attempting to swim alongside or guide the wagons, could be swept away, their cries lost in the roar of the river. Even if you made it across physically unscathed, your supplies might be soaked and ruined, a disaster in itself. The loss of a wagon was catastrophic, often forcing a family to abandon their journey or rely on the charity of others. Historians still argue about which river presented the greatest overall challenge to the emigrants. Was it the wide, deceptive Platte, the swift, cold, green river, or the mighty, terrifying Snake River with its deep canyons and turbulent currents? Each had its own unique set of hazards, and each crossing was a major event, talked about with trepidation beforehand and relief, or sorrow, afterward. The journals are full of dramatic accounts of these crossings, near misses, tragic losses, and acts of heroism. A quirky or fringe tidbit involves the sometimes desperate measures taken to get precious items across dry. People might try to float smaller, valuable items on small individual rafts, or carry them on their heads while wading or swimming. There are even tales of pioneers attempting to waterproof their watches by sealing them in beeswax, or trying to protect books by wrapping them in multiple layers of oilcloth. The ingenuity was admirable, even if the results were often mixed. You might see someone trying to swim a chicken coop across, with the chickens squawking in protest, looking like a bizarre feathered regatta. The psychological stress of a major river crossing cannot be overstated. Days, sometimes weeks, might be spent camped on the riverbank, waiting for the water level to drop or for your turn at a crowded ferry, or for the train to organise itself for the attempt. You'd watch other wagons cross, sometimes successfully, sometimes with disastrous consequences, all the while knowing your turn was coming. The noise, the shouting, the panicked bellowing of animals, the churning water. It was an assault on the senses and the nerves. And once you were finally, blessedly on the other side, soaked to the bone, exhausted, your belongings damp and disordered, there was no time for rest. The wagons had to be reassembled if they'd been floated, goods had to be unpacked and dried, animals needed to be tended, and then the journey continued with the knowledge that another river, another drowning machine probably lay just a few days or weeks ahead. These crossings were a brutal filter, weeding out the unlucky, the unprepared, and the simply overwhelmed. Each successful crossing was a victory hard won, but the memory of the cold, grasping water and the fear of a watery grave would linger long after your clothes had dried. You've wrestled your wagon across another treacherous river, your nerves are frayed, your belongings are probably still damp, and you're beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, the worst of the physical obstacles are behind you. You might even allow yourself a fleeting moment of optimism. That's usually when Mother Nature decides to remind you who's really in charge out here on the plains and in the mountains. Beyond the daily grind and the obvious hazards, you now face nature's fury unleashed, a spectacular and terrifying display of atmospheric power that can turn your already difficult journey into a fight for sheer survival. The weather on the Great Plains and in the Rocky Mountains is a fickle beast, prone to sudden, violent mood swings. One moment you might be sweltering under a blazing sun, the air still and heavy, and the next the sky can turn a bruised, angry black, unleashing a thunderstorm of terrifying intensity. These aren't your gentle spring showers. These are prairie thunderstorms, accompanied by gale-force winds that can threaten to rip the canvas covers right off your wagons, blinding sheets of rain that turn the trail into an impassable quagmire in minutes, and lightning that seems to split the sky in two, striking terrifyingly close. A mainstream historical fact is that lightning strikes were a genuine danger, occasionally killing emigrants and more frequently their livestock, which tended to huddle together during storms, making them a larger target. There's nowhere to hide on the open prairie. You just have to cower in your wagon, listening to the thunder roar and hoping your canvas roof holds. Then there's the hail. Prairie hailstorms can be incredibly violent, producing hailstones ranging from the size of peas to grapefruits, or even larger. Imagine being pelted with chunks of ice falling from the sky at high velocity. It's painful, it's damaging, and it's utterly terrifying. Hailstones could injure or kill animals, shred wagon covers to ribbons, and leave emigrants bruised and battered. You'd try to protect your head with whatever was at hand, a cook pot, a thick blanket, and hope the storm passed quickly. The aftermath of a severe hailstorm was a scene of devastation. Tattered canvas, injured livestock, and a landscape covered in a layer of icy marbles. Well, on the bright side, you might quip, nursing a lump on your head, we won't need to chip ice for the lukewarm lemonade tonight. Nobody laughs. Prairie fires were another terrifying threat, especially during dry seasons. A spark from a carelessly tended campfire, a lightning strike in dry grass, or even a deliberately set fire, though motivations for this were complex and varied, could ignite the vast grasslands, creating an inferno that moved with terrifying speed, driven by the prairie winds. The sight of a towering wall of smoke and flame racing towards your wagon train was the stuff of nightmares. Your only defence was to try and outrun it, if possible, or to find a recently burned area or wide river to act as a firebreak. Sometimes, emigrants would desperately try to set backfires, intentionally burning a patch of grass ahead of the main fire to create a barrier, a dangerous and often unpredictable tactic. The heat, the smoke, the panic of the animals, the desperate rush to escape, a prairie fire was a true vision of hell on earth. And just when you think you've experienced the worst of the heat and storms, the trail can throw a sudden unseasonable cold snap or blizzard at you, especially as you gain elevation heading into the mountains, or if you're travelling late in the season. One day, you might be dealing with oppressive heat, and the next, you could be battling freezing winds and unexpected snowfall. This was particularly dangerous for those who were caught unprepared, with inadequate clothing or insufficient fuel. Animals, already weakened by the journey, could succumb quickly to the cold. Emigrants could suffer from frostbite or hypothermia. A sudden mountain blizzard could trap a wagon train for days, depleting precious food supplies and turning the hopeful journey into a desperate fight for survival. Remember the Donner Party? Their tragic fate was sealed in large part by being caught by early, heavy snows in the Sierra Nevada. Historians still argue about the relative impact of these different weather phenomena on the overall success or failure of wagon trains. While a single thunderstorm might cause temporary delays and discomfort, a sustained drought, a major prairie fire, or an early blizzard could have far more devastating and long-lasting consequences, potentially halting a train entirely or forcing it to make desperate choices. The unpredictability was a key factor. You simply never knew what the next day's weather might bring. A quirky, or perhaps just miserably relatable tidbit is how emigrants tried to cope with the sheer discomfort of it all. When it was hot and dusty, they'd wrap wet cloths around their faces or try to rig makeshift sunshades on their wagons. When it was cold, they'd huddle together for warmth, wear every layer of clothing they possessed, and jealously guard the meagre warmth of the campfire. There are accounts of people sleeping with their water kegs in their wagons during cold snaps to try and prevent the water from freezing solid. The ingenuity born of desperation is a recurring theme. You might find yourself debating the merits of using your last clean shirt as a dust mask versus saving it for the unlikely event of meeting someone important in the next 500 miles. The psychological impact of this constant battle against the elements was significant. It added another layer of stress and uncertainty to an already overburdened existence. You'd scan the horizon not just for water or forage, but for the telltale signs of an approaching storm. Every sunrise was a question mark. Would it be a day of oppressive heat, or bone-chilling cold, or violent storms? This relentless exposure to nature's raw power could be awe-inspiring at times, but more often it was simply exhausting and frightening. It chipped away at your resolve, making the distant dream of Oregon seem even further away, hidden behind a veil of dust, smoke, or snow. You're not just a traveller, you're a tiny, insignificant speck at the mercy of vast, impersonal forces, and those forces seem to enjoy playing rough. You've battled storms, crossed rivers, and somehow kept your rickety wagon moving, all while dreaming of the supposedly empty lands of Oregon. But the lands you're crossing aren't empty at all. They are the ancestral homes, hunting grounds, and sacred territories of numerous Native American tribes. Your encounters with these indigenous peoples will be a defining feature of your journey, and they will be far more complex and varied than the simple, hostile caricatures often portrayed in later fiction. This is where you confront native realities, not myths. First, let's dispel a major misconception, largely fueled by dime novels and Hollywood westerns. The idea that wagon trains were under constant, unrelenting attack from savage Indians. While conflicts and violent encounters certainly did occur, a mainstream historical fact is that peaceful trade and wary coexistence were far more common interactions than outright warfare, especially in the earlier years of the Oregon Trail. Most tribes were initially more curious, or perhaps cautiously opportunistic, than inherently hostile towards the first waves of emigrants. They often saw the wagon trains as a potential source of trade goods, tobacco, tools, cloth, beads, in exchange for food, guidance, or safe passage. You'll encounter a variety of tribes as you move west. The Pawnee, Sioux, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Shoshone, Bannock, Cayuse, Nez Perce, and many others, each with their own distinct cultures, languages, and relationships with the land and with other tribes. Your preconceived notions, likely shaped by sensationalized newspaper accounts or frontier gossip back east, will quickly be challenged by the reality on the ground. You might expect to see war-painted warriors behind every bluff, but instead, you're more likely to encounter a family group looking to trade, or a hunting party observing your strange procession from a distance. That's not to say there was no danger. As the numbers of emigrants swelled year after year, the impact on the land and its resources became undeniable. Wagon trains depleted grazing areas, scared away game, and consumed timber and water resources. This increasing pressure inevitably led to friction, and, at times, conflict. Some tribes, understandably, began to resent the intrusion and the disruption to their way of life. Petty theft of livestock or goods from the wagons could occur, sometimes out of desperation, sometimes as a form of resistance or to exact a toll for passage through their lands. These incidents, while often minor, could easily escalate if mishandled by nervous or aggressive emigrants. A stolen horse could lead to a panicked volley of gunfire, which could in turn lead to retaliation. The emigrants themselves were a mixed bag. Some were fearful and trigger-happy, viewing any Native American with suspicion and hostility. Others were more open-minded, curious, and willing to engage in peaceful trade and interaction. Your own attitudes and actions, and those of your fellow travellers, will significantly shape the nature of your encounters. A show of respect, a willingness to trade fairly, and an avoidance of provocative behaviour could often ensure peaceful passage. Conversely, arrogance, aggression, or broken promises could quickly sour relations. You might find yourself frustrated with a member of your own party whose careless actions threaten to endanger everyone. For heaven's sake, Jedediah, stop trying to trade your broken harmonica for their chief's war bonnet. You're going to get us all killed. Historians still argue about the primary drivers of conflict between emigrants and Native Americans on the trail. Was it primarily resource competition? Was it cultural misunderstanding and prejudice? Or was it a more calculated resistance by tribes seeing their lands and way of life irrevocably altered? The answer is likely a complex combination of all these factors, varying by time, location, and the specific tribes and emigrant groups involved. It's important to remember that Native Americans were not a monolithic entity. Different tribes had different policies and attitudes towards the emigrants, and these could change over time. One quirky or fringe tidbit relates to the intense curiosity that often characterized initial encounters. Native Americans were fascinated by the emigrants' wagons, their clothing, their tools, and their strange customs. Emigrants, in turn, were often equally curious about Native American dress, languages, and lifestyles. There are accounts of mutual inspections, with groups of emigrants and Native Americans warily observing each other, sometimes leading to tentative sign language conversations or the exchange of small gifts. Imagine the scene: a group of Lakota warriors, resplendent in their traditional attire, solemnly examining a cast-iron stove that some optimistic pioneer is hauling to Oregon, while the pioneer's children stare wide-eyed at the warriors' feathered headdresses. It's a moment of profound cultural collision, tinged with both apprehension and wonder. You'll also rely on Native Americans for crucial assistance, whether you realize it or not. Many of the trails you follow were originally Native American trade routes. You might trade for essential supplies like fresh meat, fish, or vegetables, a welcome break from your monotonous trail diet. In some cases, native guides were hired to help navigate difficult terrain or find elusive water sources. Their knowledge of the land was unparalleled and often indispensable. However, as the years passed and the flow of emigrants became a flood, the dynamic shifted. The diseases you carry, like measles and smallpox, to which native populations had little immunity, had devastating impacts, often far ahead of the main wave of settlement. The US government's policies of treaty-making, often coercive and quickly broken, and the establishment of military forts along the trail, further altered the landscape and the balance of power. The bison herds, essential to the Plains tribes' way of life, were being decimated. The initial curiosity and cautious trade increasingly gave way to resentment, desperation, and in some areas and times organised resistance. So, as you travel, remember that you are an intruder in someone else's home. Your survival may depend not on your firearms, but on your diplomacy, your respect, and your willingness to see the people you encounter not as obstacles or savages, but as complex human beings facing an unprecedented crisis. The myths are easy and sensational. The realities are far more nuanced, and ultimately far more tragic for the original inhabitants of the land you so eagerly seek to claim. You've navigated hostile terrain, unpredictable weather, and complex human encounters. Each mile gained feels like a small victory, but the journey is taking its toll, not just on your body and your supplies, but on your spirit. And nothing underscores the grim reality of the Oregon Trail more starkly than the constant silent testimonials to past failures that line the route. The trailside tombs, these makeshift graves, some marked, many not, are a pervasive and deeply unsettling presence, a daily reminder that many who started this journey with dreams as bright as yours never saw them fulfilled. Trailside tombs tell tales, and those tales are invariably ones of sorrow and loss. From the moment you leave the jumping-off points, you begin to see them. At first, they might be infrequent, isolated mounds of earth, perhaps with a crudely fashioned wooden cross or a pile of stones to deter scavengers. But as you venture deeper into the wilderness, especially along stretches notorious for disease or difficult crossings, the graves become more frequent. Sometimes you'll pass several in a single day. They are a chilling, ever-present memento mori. You can't help but look at them and wonder about the stories they represent. A child grouper to measles, a young mother lost to cholera, a man killed in a hunting accident. Each grave is a punctuation mark in someone else's unfinished story of Oregon. A mainstream historical fact is that burial practices on the trail were, by necessity, hasty and often rudimentary. There were no undertakers, no embalmers, no quiet country churchyards. When someone died, they were typically buried quickly, often within hours, to prevent the spread of disease, if that was the cause of death, and because the wagon train needed to keep moving. The deceased would be wrapped in a blanket or a piece of canvas, sometimes placed in a shallow grave dug with whatever tools were at hand, often just spades and axes. If wood was available, a simple coffin might be constructed from wagon boards, but often there was no wood to spare, or no time. The graves were often deliberately disguised to try and protect them from being disturbed by animals or grimly by humans. Sometimes, the wagons of the train would be driven over the grave to pack down the earth and erase the signs of digging. Other times, a fire would be built over the spot for the same reason. Markers, if left at all, were usually simple: a name carved into a piece of wood, a rock, or even a buffalo skull. Sometimes, a poignant message was left. Sarah Keyes, died May 29th, 1846, aged 70. Or John Torrance, cholera, June 10th, 1852. Pray for his soul. These brief epitaphs speak volumes of the grief and loss experienced on the trail. You read them, and a cold knot forms in your stomach. That could be you. That could be your child, your spouse. The sheer number of these graves was staggering. It's estimated that there was, on average, one grave for every 80 yards of the Oregon Trail in some sections, particularly along the Platte River where cholera was rampant. While this figure might be an overestimation by some accounts, there's no denying that the trail was in many places a veritable linear cemetery. You try not to dwell on it, but the constant visual reminder of death wears on your soul. It becomes a part of the landscape, as common as sagebrush or distant buttes. Another one, someone might mutter as you pass a fresh mound of earth, and a sombre quiet would fall over your little group. Historians still argue about the precise psychological impact of these trailside graves on the emigrants. Did it harden them, making them more stoic and resigned to the ever-present possibility of death? Or did it foster a deeper sense of fear and despair, a constant gnawing anxiety? Perhaps it was a mixture of both. The diaries of the pioneers often record these passings with a stark, factual brevity, but underneath the stoic prose, one can often sense a deep well of sorrow and apprehension. They knew that leaving a loved one in an unmarked grave, thousands of miles from civilization, was a profound act of abandonment, forced by cruel necessity. A quirky, or rather deeply melancholic tidbit is the effort some emigrants went to in order to preserve the memory of their lost loved ones, or to try and ensure their graves wouldn't be entirely forgotten. Some would make detailed notes in their journals about the location of a grave, referencing nearby landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a bend in the river, in the faint hope that they or someone else might be able to find it again one day. Others might plant a cutting from a familiar tree or a handful of seeds from back home on the grave, a small desperate gesture to link the lost one to the life they left behind and the life they would never see. These small acts of remembrance in the face of such overwhelming desolation are incredibly poignant. You might see a wilted wildflower placed carefully on a small mound, and your heart aches for the unknown mourner. The presence of these graves also served as a grim form of information. A cluster of fresh graves could indicate a recent cholera outbreak, prompting your wagon train to push on quickly, or to camp well away from that tainted spot. A grave near a difficult river crossing was a silent warning. The dead, in their own way, were still communicating with the living, offering cautionary tales. As the miles wear on, you might become somewhat desensitized to the sight of them. It's a defense mechanism, a way to cope with the constant proximity of death. But every now and then, a particular grave will catch your eye. Perhaps one for a child marked with a crudely carved toy, or one with a particularly sorrowful inscription, and the full weight of the trail's human cost will hit you anew. It's a sobering, humbling experience. You're walking, quite literally, in the footsteps of the dead, on a road paved with their unfulfilled dreams. The trailside tombs are a constant, silent chorus, whispering of the fragility of life and the immense gamble you've taken. And with everyone you pass, you can't help but wonder if you'll be lucky enough to avoid becoming one of them yourself. You're navigating a landscape littered with the sorrows of those who came before, trying your best not to join their ranks. The wagon train, for all its discomforts and internal squabbles, has become your lifeline, a small moving island of humanity in a vast and indifferent wilderness. The thought of being separated from it, of facing this immensity alone, is a terrifying prospect. Getting lost or being deliberately left behind means almost certain doom. This isn't a casual stroll where you can just catch the next bus. This is the 19th century, and out here, isolation is a death sentence. It's surprisingly easy to get separated from the train. Perhaps you wander off a little too far in search of game, or to find a private spot for a necessary break, a luxury in itself. Maybe you're lagging behind, your oxen are particularly slow that day, or your wagon suffers a minor breakdown. A loose wheel, a slipping load, and by the time you've fixed it, the main body of the train has disappeared over the horizon, obscured by dust or a line of hills. Panic sets in. The trail, which seemed so clear when you were part of the group, suddenly looks vague and indistinct. Which set of ruts did they follow? Did they turn off towards that distant clump of trees or continue straight ahead? Children are particularly vulnerable. They might wander off chasing a butterfly or exploring a nearby creek, and in the noise and confusion of a moving train, their absence might not be noticed for some time. The frantic search that ensues, the desperate calls of parents echoing across the empty landscape, are heartbreaking. Sometimes, the child is found, tired and scared, but safe. Other times, they are not. The wilderness is vast, and a small child is easily swallowed by it. A mainstream historical fact is that many wagon trains had strict rules about children staying close to the wagons. But in the long, monotonous days, vigilance could lapse with tragic consequences. Being intentionally left behind was a rarer, but even more chilling prospect. This might happen if someone became too ill to travel, particularly with a contagious disease like cholera. While many trains would halt for a day or two to care for the sick, if the illness persisted and threatened the health of the entire company, a brutal decision might be made. The sick individual, perhaps with a family member who chose to stay with them, would be left with some supplies, a tent, and a prayer, while the train moved on. It was a grim calculation of survival, the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few. Imagine the desolation of watching the last wagon disappear, knowing you've been abandoned to face your fate alone. Don't worry, we'll send help back from Fort Laramie, they might shout, but you know, and they know, it's an empty promise. Getting lost as a group was also possible, especially if your guide was inexperienced, or the trail markers were obscured by weather or time. Taking a wrong turn, following a false trail, could lead you into difficult, waterless country, miles off the established route. The realization that you are lost with dwindling supplies and no clear idea of how to get back on track would be terrifying. The recriminations, the fear, the desperate consultations of crude maps and unreliable compasses. It would be a true test of leadership and group cohesion. Historians still argue about the frequency with which individuals or small groups became permanently lost from wagon trains. Diaries often mention temporary separations and anxious searches, but definitive accounts of those who simply vanished without a trace are, by their nature, hard to come in. However, the fear of it was very real, and it underpinned the discipline and communal rules of most wagon trains. Stray too far, shirk your duties, cause trouble, and you risked not just censure, but the terrifying possibility of being cast out. A quirky, or perhaps just deeply unsettling tidbit is the various methods people used to try and signal their location if they became lost, or to find their way back to the train. They might fire their guns at intervals, hoping the sound would carry. They might build smoky fires. Some accounts tell of people leaving notes weighted down by rocks, or blazing marks on trees, if any trees were available. Others would try to backtrack, looking for familiar landmarks, a process made incredibly difficult in the often featureless prairie or confusing broken terrain of the mountains. You might climb the highest point you can find, your heart pounding, desperately scanning the horizon for the reassuring sight of white canvas wagon tops, only to see an endless expanse of nothing. The feeling of insignificance, of being a tiny lost speck in an overwhelming landscape, would be crushing. If you're alone, or in a very small group, your chances of survival plummet. You have limited food and water. You are more vulnerable to predators, both animal and human. You lack the collective strength and knowledge of the larger group for dealing with emergencies or navigating. The psychological toll of isolation, the fear and despair, can be just as debilitating as hunger or thirst. Every shadow seems to hold a threat. Every unfamiliar sound makes you jump. Your imagination, fueled by anxiety, can conjure all sorts of horrors. The wagon train is your herd. There's safety in numbers, however dysfunctional those numbers might sometimes be. The shared knowledge, the mutual support, the simple companionship. These are essential for survival. To be cut off from that is to be truly adrift. So you stick close, you follow the rules, mostly. You tolerate your annoying neighbours in the next wagon, because the alternative is a solitude so profound, so dangerous, that it's almost unthinkable. You count the wagons ahead of you and behind you, a ritual of reassurance. You listen for the familiar sounds of the train, the creak of wheels, the shouts of the teamsters, the lowing of oxen, and they are, in their own way, a comforting lullaby, warding off the terrifying silence of being utterly and hopelessly alone. Lost and left behind is not a chapter you want in your Oregon Trail story. Let's say you've managed to avoid getting lost, shot, drowned, or claimed by cholera, but you've come down with something nasty. Perhaps it's a raging fever, a deeply infected wound from that little oops with the axe, or that summer complaint that's been going around and feels suspiciously like the early stages of something much worse. Your thoughts turn, with a mixture of hope and dread, to the medical expertise available on the wagon train. Prepare to be underwhelmed and possibly horrified. Your 19th century medical options in the form of dubious doctors and desperate cures are often more dangerous than the ailments they purport to treat. First, understand that doctor was a loosely applied term on the frontier. While some wagon trains were fortunate enough to have a formally trained physician among their number, many were not. More often, the designated healer was someone with a bit of practical experience, a chest of vaguely medicinal-looking bottles and powders, or simply a confident bedside manner. This could be a Thompsonian doctor, a follower of Samuel Thompson, who believed all disease stemmed from cold and advocated treatments involving steam baths and potent herbal emetics like lobelia, the pukeweed. Or it might be a botanic physician with a bewildering array of herbal remedies, some benign, some actively harmful. Or perhaps it's just Aunt Polly, who has a reputation for her poultices and a stern belief in the curative powers of prayer and castor oil. A mainstream historical fact is that medical licensing and standards were virtually non-existent in many parts of the US at this time, especially on the frontier. Anyone could call themselves a doctor. The medical theories underpinning treatments were often based on ancient humoral pathology. The idea that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four bodily humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Therefore, treatments aimed to restore this balance, often through heroic and debilitating measures. Bloodletting was still a common practice for a wide range of ailments, from fevers to inflammation. The theory was that bad blood needed to be removed, so your trailside doctor might whip out a lancet and open a vein, or apply leeches, draining you of precious blood when you're already weakened by illness and malnutrition. It seems counterintuitive, because it absolutely was. Feeling a bit peaky, are we? Let's just drain a pint or two of that vital fluid. You'll be right as rain, or at least significantly paler. Purging and blistering were also popular. Calomel, mercurous chloride, a toxic heavy metal, was a go-to purgative, designed to violently cleanse the bowels. It caused profuse salivation, loosened teeth, and could lead to mercury poisoning. But hey, at least you weren't constipated anymore. Blistering involved applying caustic substances to the skin to create large, painful blisters, under the theory that this would draw out toxins or counter-irritate the illness. Imagine having a throbbing, infected wound, and the doctor decides the best course of action is to create another, even angrier wound right next to it. Fun times. Surgical procedures, when absolutely necessary, like for a compound fracture or a deep festering wound, were performed without anaesthesia as we know it. Whiskey or laudanum, an opium tincture, might be given to try and dull the pain, but the patient was usually very much awake and aware. Saws, knives and probes were often unsterilised, leading to a high risk of post-operative infection, which was frequently fatal. Amputation was a common outcome for severely damaged limbs, a brutal but sometimes life-saving last resort. The surgeon might be the company blacksmith, whose experience with metal and force was deemed sufficient. The screams would be audible throughout the camp. When it came to medications, your options were a colourful and often alarming assortment. Patent medicines were hugely popular, advertised with wild claims and sold in impressive-looking bottles. These concoctions often contained high levels of alcohol, opium, morphine, or even cocaine, which could make you feel temporarily better, or at least pleasantly numb, but did nothing to cure the underlying disease and could lead to addiction. Herbal remedies abounded, some based on traditional Native American knowledge, others on European folk medicine. Willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, might genuinely help with fever and pain. Other remedies, like rattlesnake oil for rheumatism or skunk grease for croup, were more optimistic. Historians still argue about the net effect of 19th century medical interventions. Were patients more likely to survive because of the doctor's care, or in spite of it? Given the prevalence of harmful treatments like bloodletting and mercury poisoning, and the lack of understanding of germ theory, it's a grim debate. Often, the best a doctor could do was provide comfort, reassurance, and perhaps some basic nursing care. Sometimes doing nothing was the safest option. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the sheer inventiveness, and sometimes desperation, behind some of the folk remedies. Got a toothache? Apply a poultice of tobacco and red pepper. A persistent cough? Swallow a syrup made from honey and onions, or perhaps inhale the smoke from burning tar. For snakebite, a popular cure was to cut open the wound, suck out the venom, a dangerous practice for the sucker, and then apply a poultice of gunpowder and salt, or even a freshly killed chicken split open and laid on the bite. The chicken, presumably, was less enthusiastic about this particular remedy. You might watch your camp doctor earnestly preparing a brew of boiled earthworms and tree bark, assuring you it's an old family recipe for the ague, and you'd have to make a serious judgment call about whether you're more scared of the ague or the earthworms. So when you fall ill on the Oregon Trail, you're placing your faith in a system that is, by modern standards, alarmingly primitive and often actively harmful. Your best hope is a strong constitution, a bit of luck, and perhaps a caregiver who prioritizes clean water, rest, and basic nourishment over heroic, debilitating interventions. The cures are often as frightening as the diseases, and the doctors are operating with a pharmacopoeia and a theoretical framework that belongs to a much earlier and much deadlier era of medicine. Good luck, you're going to need it. And maybe hide the leeches just in case. Let's imagine, against considerable odds, that you've actually made it. You've survived the dubious doctors, the trailside tombs, the drowning machines, the bad water, the worse food, the animal agony, the prairie schooner prison, and the initial chaos. You've dragged your weary bones and your even wearier family across 2,000 miles of unforgiving terrain. You see the lush, green expanse of the Willamette Valley opening before you, just like in those pamphlets that now seem like a distant, almost cruel joke. You've arrived in Oregon. Paradise found, right? Time to kick back, plant a few seeds, and watch your prosperity bloom. Not so fast. Reaching Oregon is just the start of new hardships. Welcome to Beyond the Trail, Homestead Horrors. The dream you were sold was one of fertile land, free for the taking, or nearly so under legislation like the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850, a mainstream historical fact that promised hundreds of acres to settlers, and the land was fertile in many places, but it wasn't empty, cleared and ready for planting with a charming little cabin already built. What you found was often dense forest that needed to be cleared tree by agonizing tree, or thick prairie sod that had to be broken with back-breaking labour using primitive ploughs. That first year, especially if you arrived late in the season, was often a desperate race against time to erect some kind of shelter, before winter set in, and to get any kind of crop in the ground to see you through until the next harvest. Your first home in Oregon probably isn't the picturesque farmhouse you envisioned. It's more likely a crude, hastily built log cabin, perhaps with a dirt floor, a leaky roof made of shakes or bark, and windows covered with oiled paper or cloth, because glass is a luxury you can't yet afford. Or If timber is scarce in your chosen spot, it might even be a soddy, a house built from bricks of prairie sod, which was surprisingly well insulated but also prone to snakes, insects, and the occasional dirt shower from the ceiling during a hard rain. Honey, did you see where that centipede went? I think it fell in the soup again. Romantic it is not. Clearing the land is a monumental task. Felling massive Douglas firs or wrestling with the deeply rooted prairie grasses requires immense physical exertion day after day. You're using axes, crosscut saws, and sheer muscle power. There are no chainsaws, no bulldozers. Every stump has to be grubbed out or burned. A slow, smoky process. All this while you're still recovering from the rigours of the trail, probably undernourished, and facing the psychological letdown that often comes after achieving a long and difficult goal. The Promised Land looks suspiciously like more hard work, just of a slightly different, more stationary variety. And it's not just the physical labour. You're isolated. Your nearest neighbour might be miles away. The bustling community of the Wagon train, for all its faults, is gone. Now it's just you, your family, and the immense, sometimes intimidating wilderness. Loneliness can be a profound challenge, especially for women who might be accustomed to more social interaction back east. The silence of the forest, broken only by the sounds of your own labour or the cry of an unfamiliar bird, can be unnerving. Obtaining supplies is another major hurdle. The small towns and trading posts in early Oregon are few and far between, and their stock is often limited and expensive. Things you took for granted back home, milled lumber, nails, tools, cloth, coffee, sugar, are now precious commodities that might require a multi-day journey by wagon or boat to acquire. Assuming you have anything to trade for them, you become incredibly resourceful, learning to make do, repair, and improvise. That old skill of whittling might suddenly become very valuable when you need to fashion a new door latch or a set of spoons. Historians still argue about the true economic success rates of early Oregon homesteaders. While some did eventually prosper, establishing productive farms and comfortable lives, many others struggled for years, barely eking out a subsistence living. Crop failures due to unfamiliar climate or pests, accidents, illness, or simply bad luck could quickly derail the dream. The vision of effortless abundance often clashed with the harsh reality of marginal survival. It wasn't uncommon for families to abandon their claims after a few heartbreaking years and try their luck elsewhere, or even, in some cases, to make the arduous journey back east thoroughly disillusioned. A quirky, or perhaps just grimly realistic tidbit about early homesteading life is the sheer monotony and crudeness of the diet, which often wasn't much of an improvement over what you endured on the trail, at least for the first few years. Until your fields are producing consistently, and you've managed to acquire livestock, you might be living on wild game, if you can get it, foraged plants, and whatever meagre supplies you brought with you or can trade for. You might dream of orchards and vegetable gardens, but those take time to establish. In the meantime, it's more salt pork, more cornmeal mush, and an awful lot of hope. You might find yourself developing an unhealthy craving for weevils again, just for a change of texture. And let's not forget the ongoing interactions with the Native American populations whose land you are now occupying. While the Willamette Valley tribes were generally not as militarily powerful as some of the Plains tribes, resentment over land encroachment and broken treaties led to tensions and occasional outbreaks of violence, like the Cayuse War in the late 1840s and early 1850s. So even in paradise, the fear of conflict could still be a background hum to your daily life. The Oregon you finally reach is not the finished product. It's a raw, challenging frontier that demands even more resilience, more labour, and more sacrifice than the trail itself. The journey might be over, but the struggle for survival and success has just entered a new, and in many ways even more demanding phase. That beautiful, sun-drenched valley you dreamed of still requires an immense amount of sweat, toil, and heartbreak to make it your own. Your homestead horrors are just beginning, but at least the wagon isn't bumping along anymore. Small mercies. You've wrestled a rudimentary homestead from the Oregon wilderness, the physical labour's relentless, and the comforts are few. But the challenges aren't just external. The long, arduous journey and the subsequent isolation of frontier life take a profound toll on your psyche. The crushing boredom, the pervasive fear, and the profound loneliness begin to play tricks on your mind. Welcome to the subtle, insidious world of mind games and madness. where your own thoughts can become as formidable an enemy as any physical hardship. Think about the journey itself. Months spent in a state of heightened vigilance, facing constant threats, disease, accidents, starvation, unpredictable weather, potential conflict. Your nervous system has been on high alert for an extended period. Now, even if the immediate life-threatening dangers have somewhat receded on your new homestead, that ingrained anxiety doesn't just switch off. Every unfamiliar sound in the night, every shadow in the woods, can trigger that old fear. Is it a wolf, a bear, a disgruntled neighbour, or just the wind playing tricks on your overactive imagination? Then there's the boredom, a surprisingly potent corrosive. On the trail, while monotonous, the daily routine was driven by the urgent need to make miles. There was always something that had to be done. Now, on your isolated claim, especially during the long, wet Oregon winters when outdoor work is difficult, the days can stretch out with an unnerving sameness. The same few faces, your family, if they're with you, the same limited activities, the same four walls of your crude cabin. Conversation dries up. You've told all your stories, aired all your grievances. The silence can become oppressive, breeding introspection that can easily turn dark. Mainstream historical fact is that cabin fever was a recognised phenomenon, a kind of seasonal affective disorder exacerbated by confinement and lack of stimulation, leading to irritability, depression, and sometimes erratic behaviour. The lack of intellectual and social stimulation is profound. Back east, even in a small village, there was news, gossip, church gatherings, community events. Here, you might go weeks or even months without seeing anyone outside your immediate family. Books, if you manage to bring any, are read and reread until the pages are worn thin. The mental landscape can become as barren as a clear-cut forest if you're not careful. You might find yourself having long, detailed conversations with your remaining ox, or developing an unhealthy obsession with the patterns in the wood grain on your cabin wall. Bertha the ox really understands me, you might muse. Her sympathetic moos are so insightful. Fear remains a constant companion, though its nature might shift. Fear of crop failure, of illness striking when the nearest doctor, however dubious, is a day's journey away. Fear of accidents, fear of the unknown dangers lurking in the vast wilderness that surrounds your tiny patch of civilization. This low-grade, chronic fear eats away at your peace of mind, making it difficult to relax, to feel truly secure. Sleep might be troubled by nightmares, replays of trail traumas, or anxieties about the future. For women, the isolation could be particularly acute. While men often had the physical labour of clearing land or hunting to occupy them, women were frequently confined to the cabin or its immediate vicinity, burdened with childcare, cooking, mending, and a host of other domestic chores, often with limited resources and in incredibly primitive conditions. The lack of female companionship, the absence of the social support networks they might have had back home, could lead to profound loneliness and depression. Diaries from pioneer women often speak of a deep yearning for connection, for a friendly face, for a conversation that doesn't revolve around the price of flour or the likelihood of rain. Historians still argue about the prevalence and nature of mental illness on the frontier. Diagnoses were, of course, non-existent by modern standards. Behaviour that we might now recognise as symptoms of depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD, or even psychosis might have been dismissed as melancholy, nerves, or simple eccentricity. Yet, accounts of strange behaviour, deep depressions, and even suicides among settlers suggest that the mental toll was significant. The strong, silent pioneer archetype often masks a deeper story of emotional struggle. A quirky, or perhaps just deeply sad, tidbit is the phenomenon sometimes referred to as prairie madness, or plains madness. While more commonly associated with settlers on the Great Plains rather than specifically in Oregon, the underlying causes, isolation, hardship, the vast overwhelming landscape, were similar. Symptoms were said to include withdrawal, fits of weeping, violent outbursts, and a general detachment from reality. Some folklorists suggest that the constant wind of the plains, or the unending featureless horizon, could literally drive people insane. While perhaps an oversimplification, it speaks to the profound psychological impact of an environment so alien and demanding. You might find yourself staring out at the endless rain of an Oregon winter, feeling a similar sense of oppressive vastness, a grey melancholy seeping into your bones. The lack of familiar social structures and supports also meant that when someone did begin to unravel mentally, there were few resources to help them. Families had to cope as best they could, often in secret, ashamed or frightened by the changes in their loved one. There were no mental health professionals, no support groups, just the stark reality of dealing with a mind under siege alone in the wilderness. You try to stay busy, to focus on the tasks at hand, to maintain a routine. You tell yourself you're strong, you're a survivor. But the mind is a tricky thing. The silence of the frontier can amplify your inner demons. The hardships can crack even the toughest resolve. The dream of Oregon, which sustained you through so much, might start to feel like a cruel mirage, and the isolation you now face can be a heavier burden than any you carried on the trail. The mind games are subtle, but they can be just as deadly as any physical threat, slowly eroding your hope, your sanity, and your will to endure. You're battling the elements, the isolation, and possibly your own slowly fraying sanity on your Oregon homestead. You'd think that having survived the trail and established a claim, you'd at least be free from the petty squabbles and more serious disputes that occasionally plagued the wagon train. Think again. Human nature, it turns out, is remarkably consistent, even in the supposed Eden of the Willamette Valley. Conflicts arise, disagreements fester, and when they do, you'll quickly discover another charming feature of frontier life. No sheriff, big problems. You must navigate disputes and try to achieve some semblance of justice without the established legal structures you might have taken for granted back east. In the early days of Oregon settlement, formal law enforcement and a functioning court system were often miles away, if they existed at all in your particular neck of the woods. A mainstream historical fact is that the Provisional Government of Oregon was established by settlers in 1843, an attempt to bring some order to the territory, but its reach and effectiveness were limited, especially in more remote areas. Sheriffs were few and far between, judges were circuit riders who might visit your area once or twice a year, and jails were often non-existent or laughably insecure. This meant that for many everyday disputes, and even for some more serious crimes, communities had to rely on informal methods of justice. So, what happens when your neighbour's pig repeatedly wanders into your meticulously planted vegetable patch, devouring your precious seedlings? Or what if you have a disagreement over a boundary line, a debt owed, or the ownership of a stray calf? You can't just call the cops or file a lawsuit in small claims court. Your first recourse is likely direct negotiation, which, depending on the temperament of your neighbour and your own diplomatic skills, might resolve the issue or might escalate it into a simmering feud. Remember Jedediah from the wagon train, the one with the questionable trading practices? Imagine he's now your neighbour, and he's accidentally fenced off a portion of your spring. Good luck reasoning with him. If direct negotiation fails, the community might get involved. Disputes could be brought before an informal council of elders or respected members of the settlement. These individuals would listen to both sides, perhaps interview witnesses, and then render a judgment. This system relied heavily on community consensus and social pressure to enforce its decisions. If the court decided your neighbour owed you compensation for the pig-related damages, the weight of public opinion might be enough to compel him to pay up. But what if he's stubborn, or unpopular, or simply doesn't care what the neighbours think? Then you're back to square one, possibly with an even angrier neighbour. For more serious offences, theft, assault, or even murder, the absence of formal law enforcement could lead to more drastic measures. Vigilante justice, while often romanticized in fiction, was a grim reality in some frontier areas. If a crime was committed and the official legal system was too slow, too distant, or perceived as ineffective, a group of citizens might take matters into their own hands, forming a vigilance committee to apprehend the suspect, conduct a swift trial, often with little regard for due process, and carry out a sentence which could range from flogging or banishment to hanging. Judge Lynch held court with alarming speed and finality. While proponents argued that vigilantism was necessary to maintain order in the absence of law, it was also a dangerous system prone to error, abuse, and mob mentality. An accusation, even a false one, could quickly lead to a noose. Historians still argue about the effectiveness and fairness of these informal justice systems on the frontier. Did they generally maintain a reasonable degree of order and provide a rough-hewn but acceptable form of justice? Or were they often arbitrary, biased, and prone to violence, reflecting the prejudices and power dynamics of the local community rather than impartial legal principles. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, varying greatly from one settlement to another and from one case to another. There were instances of remarkable community solidarity and fair-minded dispute resolution, but also dark episodes of mob rule and injustice. A quirky, or perhaps just illustrative tidbit, is the way some communities dealt with persistent nuisances, or individuals deemed undesirable, short of outright vigilantism. Social ostracism could be a powerful tool. Someone who consistently flouted community norms, shirked their share of communal labour, like maintaining a road or building a schoolhouse, or engaged in sharp practices might find themselves suddenly unwelcome at social gatherings, unable to get help from neighbours in times of need, or even boycotted by local storekeepers or millers. It was a quieter but often very effective way of enforcing conformity. You might not get hanged for being a jerk, but you could find yourself very, very alone, which in a frontier environment was its own kind of slow death. The concept of property itself could be a source of endless conflict. Land claims, often poorly marked and based on vague descriptions, frequently overlapped. Disputes over water rights, who got to divert water from a shared creek for irrigation, were common and could become incredibly bitter, especially in drier areas or during drought years. Timber rights, mining claims, if gold or other minerals were discovered, and livestock branding and ownership were all potential flashpoints for conflict in a land where resources were everything, and the rules for their allocation were still being written, often on the fly. You thought you left the arguments over whose turn it was to fetch water behind on the trail, but now you're arguing over who has the right to the water in the first place. Ultimately, you and your fellow settlers are engaged in a slow, often messy process of building a civil society from the ground up. It requires a delicate balance of individual rights and community responsibilities, of self-reliance and mutual aid. In the absence of a strong formal legal framework, you rely on reputation, on unwritten codes of conduct, and on the collective will of your neighbours to maintain peace and order. It's a fragile system, easily disrupted by greed, fear, or misunderstanding. And when it breaks down, the consequences can be swift and severe. So try to be a good neighbour, keep your pigs penned, and hope that everyone else does the same. Because out here, the only sheriff in town might be your own conscience, and the only judge, the collective, and sometimes fickle opinion of your peers. After all the hardship, the suffering, the near misses, and the sheer, grinding toil of both the journey and the subsequent struggle to carve out a life in the Oregon country, you finally take a moment to look around. You've got your cabin, your small patch of cleared land, perhaps a few scrawny crops struggling to take root. Is this it? Is this the paradise you risked everything for? For many, the answer was a resounding and deeply disappointing, not really. The Willamette Valley, for all its undeniable beauty and potential fertility, often fell short of the utopian visions that had lured you westward. This is the stage of bitter arrivals, broken dreams. The pamphlets and letters that fueled Oregon fever had painted a picture of a land flowing with milk and honey, where minimal effort yielded maximum reward. A place of perpetual sunshine, figuratively speaking, abundant game, and friendly, welcoming emptiness. The reality, as you've painstakingly discovered, was far more complex and considerably less idyllic. The winters were often long, cold, and incredibly wet, turning your farm into a muddy swamp and your spirits decidedly damp. The abundant game had a tendency to be elusive when you actually needed it for dinner, and the emptiness was already being filled by other equally desperate and land-hungry settlers, leading to competition and disputes, as we've discussed. One of the first rude awakenings for many was the realization that free land wasn't exactly free. Even under the Donation Land Claim Act, there were requirements. You had to live on the land for a certain number of years and make improvements, like building a dwelling and cultivating a portion of the acreage. This meant more hard labour, more investment of time and scarce resources, before you could even secure legal title. And improvements cost money, or at least immense effort. That vision of simply sticking a shovel in the ground and watching your fortune sprout was quickly replaced by the reality of calloused hands, aching backs, and the constant anxiety of whether your efforts would be enough. Furthermore, the best, most accessible land along the rivers and in the most fertile parts of the valley was often snapped up quickly by the earliest arrivals or by those with more capital. You might have arrived to find that your ideal spot was already claimed, forcing you to settle for less desirable land further from water sources, in more heavily forested areas, or on steeper slopes. This could mean even more work to make your claim viable, and a longer, harder path to any semblance of prosperity. It's like arriving late to a potluck dinner where all the good dishes are gone, and you're left with the congealed gravy and a few broken crackers. A mainstream historical fact is that economic success in early Oregon was far from guaranteed. While some individuals and families did achieve a comfortable standard of living, and a few even became wealthy, many others struggled perpetually. The promised markets for agricultural surpluses were often distant and difficult to reach, especially before the development of better transportation infrastructure like railroads, which wouldn't arrive in a significant way for decades. You might grow a bumper crop of wheat, only to find that getting it to a place where you could sell it for a decent price was almost impossible, or that prices were depressed due to oversupply from other equally optimistic farmers. Many early Oregon farmers were essentially subsistence farmers, growing just enough to feed their families, with little left over to trade for other goods or to improve their circumstances. The social environment too could be a source of disappointment. You might have dreamed of a close-knit community of like-minded pioneers, all working together for the common good. While such communities did exist, you were just as likely to find yourself surrounded by a motley collection of individuals with vastly different backgrounds, beliefs, and levels of ambition or belligerence. The feuds over land claims, water rights, and wandering livestock could create an atmosphere of suspicion and resentment, far removed from the harmonious utopia you might have envisioned. Remember how you couldn't wait to get away from your annoying neighbours back east. Turns out, annoying neighbours are a transportable commodity. Historians still argue about the overall level of satisfaction among Oregon pioneers. Did most eventually find what they were looking for, even if it was different from their initial expectations? Or was there a pervasive sense of disillusionment, a quiet understanding that the dream had been oversold? The historical record through diaries, letters, and reminiscences shows a wide spectrum of experiences. Some expressed profound contentment with their new lives, emphasizing their independence and the satisfaction of building something from nothing. Others wrote of hardship, loneliness, and a longing for the homes and communities they had left behind. For many, it was likely a mixture of both, a grudging acceptance of the difficult realities, leavened by moments of hope and small triumphs. A quirky, or perhaps just tragically human tidbit, is the way some emigrants clung to the symbols of the life they had imagined, even when those symbols were wildly impractical in their new circumstances. That heavy oak rocking chair, the one you almost abandoned a dozen times on the trail. It might now sit in your tiny, drafty cabin, a testament to your stubborn hope, even if there's barely room to rock in it without hitting a wall or a sleeping child. These small, cherished possessions were anchors to a dream, even as the dream itself was being reshaped by the harsh realities of frontier life. You might polish your grandmother's silver teapot, also miraculously transported, even if you're drinking a Satz coffee made from burnt barley out of a tin cup. The Oregon you found wasn't a prepackaged paradise. It was a raw, challenging, and often unforgiving land that demanded everything you had to give, and then some. The golden promises that had shimmered so brightly from afar now looked a bit tarnished, a bit faded. The dream of a new beginning was still there, perhaps, but it was a harder, grittier, and far more complicated dream than the one you started with. Your arrival was not an end, but the beginning of another long, arduous chapter. The Willamette Valley wasn't a finish line, it was just a different kind of starting line, for a race that would last the rest of your life. And so, as the last echoes of your journey fade, as the dust of the trail finally settles, not into golden fields of effortless bounty, but into the stubborn soil of a hard-won homestead, a sense of quiet settles over you. The sharp edges of the hardships begin to soften, not forgotten, but perhaps integrated into the deeper narrative of your life, a testament to a resilience you never knew you possessed. The ghosts of the trail, the whispers of those who didn't make it, the phantom pains of old struggles, they become a part of the rustling leaves, the sighing wind through the tall firs. The raw, untamed Oregon that greeted you with such a challenging embrace is slowly, almost imperceptibly, yielding to your persistent efforts and to the efforts of thousands like you. The isolation, once so profound, lessens with each new neighbour, each slowly forming track that might one day become a road, each faint rumour of a distant town growing slightly larger. The acute anxieties of daily survival begin to mellow into the chronic, but perhaps more manageable, concerns of building a future, however modest. You find a different kind of beauty now, not in the grand, terrifying vistas of the trail, but in the small, incremental victories, the first successful harvest, the sturdy roof that finally doesn't leak, the quiet satisfaction of a day's hard work completed. The dreams of effortless paradise have been replaced by the more grounded reality of earned sustenance, of a life carved out by your own hands, in a place that, through your very struggle, is becoming home. The path was arduous, the cost immense, but as you sit by your hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls of your cabin, a deeper peace might begin to settle. The journey has irrevocably changed you, etching its lines onto your face and into your soul, but it has also forged you. Let the sounds of the Oregon night, the distant call of an owl, the gentle patter of rain on the roof, lull you into a well-deserved rest. The trail is behind you now, and perhaps, just perhaps, some version of that dream, weathered and worn but still recognizable, is finally within your grasp.